Hello everyone, lovely to see you all. Some familiar faces as well. We're a bit behind schedule, so I'm going to forego my usual long joke and just get right into things. Diversity is our greatest strength. Has a week gone by when we haven't heard that hackneyed trope of speech past the lips of a mayor or a cabinet minister or a police commissioner? If you Google the term, this is what shows up. And as an aside, I couldn't help but chuckle at the entirely undiverse picture here where you have 4 black soldiers. All too often, diversity is a synonym for non-white. Diversity is our greatest strength has become a sacred faith-based mantra today, and to question it is akin to modern heresy. But I want us to do that today. I want us to be heretical and ask if diversity really is our greatest strength. Has anyone who has uttered that banal triviality ever presented any evidence or examples of diversity's great might? Precisely how does it strengthen our country, our society, our communities? What verifiable benefits or improvements does it bring? Because I'm afraid the reality is that far from being our greatest strength, diversity is our greatest dilemma. And when you combine it with mass immigration and multiculturalism, it becomes arguably our greatest weakness. As I'll explain shortly, diversity, especially the super diversity we see around us today in London, Birmingham, Bradford, Burnley, etc., has made us less trusting of one another, has weakened and segregated our communities, and has reduced civic engagement, and is potentially weakening our economy too. While these well-researched downsides are a universal feature of diversity from California to Cologne, here in Britain, the disastrous policies of mass immigration and multiculturalism have aggravated these conditions in particularly nefarious ways. Over the past quarter of a century, we've seen a shocking increase in sectarianism, bigotry, homophobia, anti-Semitism, and misogyny, and we've witnessed the introduction into Britain of certain cultural beliefs and practices which are abhorrent to modern Western society and which risk destabilizing our already weakened communities. And this situation is quite without precedent in our Long Island story. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. When determining whether ethnic diversity is a strength or a weakness, we need to determine its impact on what's called social trust. And in a nutshell, social trust is a perception in the honesty, integrity, and reliability of others. In other words, do you have faith in your fellow man and your neighbor? Do you trust them? Do you trust your community and your wider population? Social trust is one of the most important indicators of the strength and quality of nations and societies around the world. And in fact, social trust corresponds more closely than any other factor in predicting economic success. It's also associated with many outcomes, including happiness and life satisfaction positively, and suicide negatively. In other words, you don't want to live in a society where you can't trust other people. In low trust societies, one has to be on one's guard, looking over one's shoulder. There's no such thing as a handshake and a gentleman's agreement. In low trust societies, people avoid paying tax. I just lost my place here. They drop litter and they prefer to hire family to do things which more qualified strangers will be better to do. The question of why successive positive societies are more trusting than others has long interested social scientists. International surveys such as the World Values Survey, which has been doing this every year since 1981, have discovered that the highest levels of social trust are in the homogeneous countries of Scandinavia, while the lowest levels of trust are to be found in South America, Africa, and parts of Asia. Now, the academic literature on social trust is very informative and surprisingly consistent, and it demonstrates time and again that increased ethnic diversity is the strongest cause of a decline in social trust, stability, and happiness. And this is particularly pronounced on the neighborhood level. The more people interact with diversity in their daily lives, the more social trust drops, and the less trusting people become in their neighbors and indeed their fellow man. Now, interestingly, social trust doesn't just drop between different races and ethnicities. Diversity causes mistrust amongst peoples of the same ethnicity too. This drop in social trust explains the phenomenon of white flight, such as the Cockney exodus from East London to Essex, and it also explains the ghettoization of segregated ethnic communities who feel higher levels of social trust if they form their own enclaves, separated and segregated from wider society. Conversely, it is areas of least diversity, homogeneous Scotland, southwest England, and wealthy London suburbs like Richmond and Hampstead that have the highest levels of social trust. So it will come as no surprise that these areas, with their lack of diversity, are the most supportive of immigration. It's easy to support something with which you have no interaction in your daily life. Now, there are some on the left who will say that areas of high diversity are often poor and that low levels of social trust are simply due to inequalities, that term beloved of the left. But as Dr. Andrew Leith of the Australian National University demonstrated in his 2006 paper on trust, inequality and ethnic diversity, inequality does not lead to a decline in social trust. It is ethnic diversity that breaks communities down. And that makes sense, of course, because if you just think back to the last century in the old working class neighborhoods, they had lives of abject poverty and economic hardship and inequalities, but they had high levels of social trust, leaving doors unlocked, leaving their children with neighbors, street parties, high levels of community engagement, helping each other out. Economists have also shown how diversity negatively affects civic engagement and social capital. People from areas of high diversity are less likely to vote, less likely to become involved in their community, less likely to volunteer or join community organizations, and they're less likely to lend money or take a risk to help other people. And this has a corrosive effect on local communities. This decline in social trust, as we can see all around this country now, leads to a lack of civic pride, a lack of maintenance of buildings and local areas, and a rise in crime, vandalism, and general decay. When a society doesn't have much in common, it's obviously much less likely that they will feel united and invested in one another. Now, the most famous study on the negative effects of diversity on social trust is 2007's Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, a professor at Harvard University. And this was the largest study ever carried out on the subject, and it analyzed levels of social trust across different parts of America. And the differences were striking and made headlines around the world. Trust levels in the areas of highest ethnic diversity were approximately half of the areas with least diversity. And he found that as diversity increased, several key indicators of social trust dropped. Lower confidence in local government and local leaders, lower frequency of registering to vote, but more interest and more knowledge of politics, more participation in protest marches and social reform, the politics of strife and division. Less confident that the community will cooperate for the good of all. So if there's a water shortage, not feeling that your neighbors are actually going to conserve water. Less likelihood of volunteering or giving to charity, fewer close friends and confidants, less happiness, lower perceived quality of life, and more time spent inside watching television rather than going up beyond your doorstep. To quote from a speech he delivered in 2006, inhabitants of diverse communities tend to withdraw from collective life, to distrust their neighbors, regardless of the color of their skin, to withdraw even from close friends, to expect the worst from their community and its leaders, to volunteer less, give less to charity and work on community projects less often, to register to vote less, to agitate for social reform more, but have less faith that they can actually make a difference, and to huddle unhappily in front of the television. Diversity, at least in the short run, seems to bring out the turtle in all of us. Now, Professor Putnam's evidence is all the more compelling because he's a dyed-in-the-wool liberal who favors both diversity and immigration, and he was uncomfortable with the results of his research. Now, those on the left, particularly progressives with a passion for social justice, will have been similarly dismayed by another Harvard University study which found that in the much admired, economically left-leaning social democracies of Northern Europe, increased ethnic diversity lowers public support for welfare programs. The taxpayers of Scandinavia are very happy to pay higher taxes for welfare, but only if it's going to people who are similar to them. Indeed, the Harvard study's authors conclude that much of the reason for America's failure to develop a welfare system akin to that found in homogeneous European nations is because of America's more diverse population mix. In other words, white people did not want to pay welfare, believing it was going to go to the black population. Now, some of you might be thinking, all right, well, that sounds very convincing, but it's very easy to carefully select some studies to support an argument. Could someone else perhaps pick out their own studies to make the opposite argument and show that there are high levels of trust with diversity? Well, actually, no. Sociologists, a group that's not known for their right-wing politics and anti-immigration stances, acknowledge that there is no evidence to support any other conclusion than the uncomfortable truth. Diversity is not a strength. Almost all of the evidence points the other way. But don't take my word for it. In a peer-reviewed paper published in 2019, Danish academics conducted a sweeping meta-analysis of the entire body of literature on this subject. They analyzed all 87 papers that have been published on the subject of diversity and social trust, hoping to ascertain whether continued immigration and growing ethnic diversity was having a positive impact on community cohesion. They found the opposite to be the case, especially in local neighborhoods. The evidence is clear. Diversity is a direct challenge to social cohesion and community trust. So what's the solution? Clearly, diversity is here to stay. Perhaps we can just teach people that we are all the same, that we're all citizens of the world who share the same values. Well, no, because we aren't and we don't. We have to stop pretending that all cultures are equal and all people are the same and share the same values. The culture in which a person was raised until their late teens or early 20s plays a crucial role in your adaptability to life in the UK. As a multiracial society, 20th century Britain made great strides towards eliminating a fear of difference between ethnicities. But following New Labour's election in '97, the combined policies of mass immigration and multiculturalism have dramatically complicated matters. Now, I think here I should probably clarify a couple of points, because having seen the response to Suella Braverman's recent conference speech, I'm conscious of how easy it is to be misunderstood or misinterpreted by those on the left, whether innocently or deliberately. For when Braverman attacked mass immigration and multiculturalism, too many critics accused her of hypocrisy. How could a brown woman, a child of immigrants, not see how she has benefited from immigration and multiculturalism? And whether ignorant or deliberately disingenuous, these critics seemed incapable of understanding the difference between the limited immigration of the past and the mass immigration of today, and between a multiracial society and a multicultural society. Suella Braverman, James Cleverly, Kwasi Kwarteng are products of the successful multiracial Britain of the 20th century, a society in which it was easy to assimilate small numbers of ethnic minorities. They are all undoubtedly British in their manner, speech, culture, dress, and humour. It's the world into which I was born and raised too. That's very different from multiculturalism. Instead of multiculturalism, 20th century Britain was defined by a predominant British monoculture. People could happily celebrate their family's foreign heritage at home, but they were actively engaged in British society and British culture. Just think of Daley Thompson or Kenny Lynch, Freddie Mercury or Linford Christie, all poster boys for integrated, multiracial Britain. This culturally British multiracial society was easy to maintain in a nation with manageable levels of immigration, approximately 50,000 per year. Today we have more than 10 times that number. We get in 1 year what was received in the entire decade of the 90s. Last year, immigration was 600,000 net, 1.2 million gross. Had we kept to 1990s low levels of immigration, we wouldn't be here today having this conference. Alas, that's not the case. We have had more immigration to this country in the past 25 years than in the past 2,000 years combined. So when Suella Braverman and I speak of multiculturalism and mass immigration, we are concerned with something very different to what the critics seem to think we mean. We're referring to the disastrous policies that have made towns and cities across this kingdom all but unrecognizable to the generations that once called them home, and which have created parallel societies of segregated populations who speak little English, have no cultural affinity with Britain, whose loyalties lie elsewhere, and whose daily lives pass with little or no interaction with wider society. More generally, failure to assimilate into the dominant British culture, as previous generations of immigrants have done, is causing a further and far more dramatic deterioration in levels of social trust and community harmony than would otherwise have been the case. Diversity has led to the politics of victimhood and grievance, of white privilege, of white supremacy and decolonization. It has instilled activists with growing confidence to make bolder demands for apologies, reparations for slavery and colonialism, the tearing down of statues and the renaming of streets. Universities are given lists of demands to create courses on diversity and inclusion. Students are calling for segregated halls for black students and demands to be taught by black faculty. An utter rejection of Martin Luther King's dream that one day his children would be judged by the color of the skin, not by the color of their skin. I knew I was going to do that. I was going to have a bet with somebody whether I would say that or not, but there we are. Diversity, multiculturalism, and mass immigration has led to the emergence in Britain today of cultural habits and practices that are abhorrent to Western society and values. Female genital mutilation, acid attacks, honor killings, rape gangs, machete fights in broad daylight. The Metropolitan Police now has a witchcraft unit training police officers how to spot evidence of child abuse linked to witchcraft rituals. As Lord Tebbit has said, we have imported far too many immigrants who have come here not to live in our society, but to replicate here the society of their homelands. And we saw stark evidence of this recently in Leicester, where Muslim and Hindu mobs clashed on the streets following a cricket match. All too often, replicating the society of their homelands means importing to these shores the conflicts, prejudices, and disputes of faraway lands. For example, we're often told that anti-Semitism, homophobia, and misogyny are on the rise in Britain, but the mainstream media refuse to name the cause. Time and again, petrified by political correctness and beholden to the ideology of multiculturalism, governments, councils, police, and other public institutions have shown themselves unwilling to face the challenge and unable to admit that, however lofty the ideal, multicultural diversity isn't a strength. It divides towns and cities and destroys social cohesion. It's in all of our interests to avoid Britain becoming a multicultural society. We must remain a united kingdom, not a United Nations. Like it or not, though, super diversity is here to stay, so we have to be prepared to tackle it head on. And to ensure that we don't dissolve into a United Nations, we need a government that will finally put a stake through the heart of multiculturalism and stop mass immigration once and for all. We need to reduce immigration by 90%, 90, to return us to the manageable rates of the 1990s, 50,000 per annum rather than 600,000 net or 1.2 million gross. Never fall for this net line that you hear from the media, even from people on the right. Net are all those coming in minus those who've left. But those who are leaving are not the same as those who are coming. It's not a like-for-like swap. We must ensure that we only let people into our country who are educated and highly skilled and who come from cultures that have views and beliefs that are compatible with Western society. Priority must be given to English-speaking people from Europe, the Anglosphere and Commonwealth. That is the only way we can hope to rebuild social trust on the local level. Along with controlling immigration, countering the negative effects of diversity requires a strong policy of assimilation and integration. And that requires the promotion of a robust and confident British culture in all areas of public life. And that's clearly in scant evidence today. So what incentive is there currently for young minorities to buy into Britain? How can we expect them to believe in Britain and the West when our media, our universities and cultural institutions denigrate Britain's legacy and the West's achievements? When minority cultures are elevated over British culture, and when our students leave school with almost no knowledge of British history or civic values. In that context, who can blame a child for cleaving more to the masculine, well-defined culture of his parents? Integration into British society can only be achieved through the moulding of young minds. Now, singing the national anthem, picture of the King in school, raising the Union flag, all good and fine, but we need to go much further. In particular, through the national curriculum at primary and secondary school levels, making history compulsory to the age of 16 and also requiring civic courses to teach our values and freedoms, because the degree of historical ignorance amongst the general population is absolutely appalling. Children must learn our magnificent island story so that they can become invested in our nation. Otherwise, they will continue to believe the nonsense that they are told about Britain and Britain's allegedly racist past, and about the supposed crimes of our heroes from Nelson to Churchill. They can't participate as active citizens today if they don't understand the past. That means learning the truth about the universality of slavery and Britain's unique role in abolishing the slave trade. Learning about the positives and the negatives of the British Empire, and learning how Britain, dare I say England, created the modern world. And we must teach them the truth about Britain and race, namely that Britain is one of the world's most tolerant and least racist countries, that racism is alive and well in much of the world, including, if not especially, in Asia and Africa, and that Britain and the Anglosphere stand in stark contrast to this. All this must form part of our core education. So, in conclusion, I would say the evidence is overwhelming. To quote Professor Putnam, increased diversity corrodes civil society by eroding shared values, customs, and institutions. Diversity destabilizes communities, destroys community spirit, makes people less civically and politically engaged, turns people into introverts who prefer to stay home rather than venture outside, and undermines faith in our fellow citizens. This weakens the bonds of civil society and social cohesion that bind a nation and its people together. Unfortunately, those in elite positions of power continue to live in regions with low diversity and high levels of social trust. As a result, they are shielded from the reality faced by millions of people in towns and cities across the kingdom. History also tells us that diversity is not a strength. Has Europe become safer after importing vast numbers of people from cultures hostile to Western values? Why has homogeneous Poland never had a terrorist attack? Does anyone believe heterogeneous nations are more united and more stable than homogeneous ones? Is America more harmonious than Poland or Japan? America's greatest period of stability and growth was between 1920 and 1960. The period when it had the least amount of immigration. That was America's golden age, an era of unprecedented unity, stability, social cohesion, and self-confidence. Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and Ireland all broke up because of heterogeneity. India and Pakistan were forged out of their incompatibility. Canada, the UK and Spain have vocal separatist nationalists. Rwanda saw Hutu and Tutsi atrocities. Iraq, Israel, Turkey, the list goes on. In the mind of the left, diversity represents the utopian ideal that all humans are equal irrespective of their culture. From the old mill towns of the north to the heart of our capital city, the experience of forced multiculturalism reveals a much darker reality. Thank you.
My question's on the lies, exaggerations and sclerotic behaviour of Britain's institutions. Lies, racist rape gangs, the ability and willingness to cover up that type of evil. Exaggerations, Britain's a nation of immigrants, and the increasing exaggerations in Black History Month that Africans have now built Stonehenge apparently. And eventually that leads to the sclerotic behaviour of institutions where the Prime Minister at one point saying multiculturalism doesn't work, but then pressing coins that said diversity built Britain. How do you explain that mess?
Thank you very much. Great speech, Ralph. The President of Germany, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, just said literally a couple of weeks ago, immigration's at breaking point. He's a socialist. The leader of the Greens said, you know, we need to, the Germans need to filter out genuine refugees more. Now, the reason that's happened is the growth of the AfD in Germany. We can't do anything about our political system in the UK. The question is going back to Robert Putnam, who, by the way, was an advisor to Bill Clinton, and as he says, on a liberal background. He was talking about the collective participation and how that's declined since the 1950s, when they used to have bowling leagues, as you know, in the US. So the question is really, well, how can conservatives get together? Because conservatives, by their very nature, are reactionary, and they're also individualistic. They don't tend to get together. They're not tend to be proactive in their campaigning. How do we overcome that to create a more participatory, collective, conservative coherence that will allow us to achieve that critical mass that will really push the Overton window on issues such as immigration? Thank you.
Sure. So briefly on the first point, you're quite right. You know, founding myths are very important to nations and countries. They serve to inspire generations. You know, so for example, you may remember Sadiq Khan recently said that London was built by immigrants, you know, a complete slap in the face to all of the generations of Londoners and Englishmen who built St Paul's Cathedral and the Houses of Parliament. But what he's doing there is he's creating a new foundation myth. The old myth of London was that it was founded by Brutus of Troy after he defeated Gog and Magog. That connected Britain to the classical world of Troy, and that was an inspirational story for generations. Now you've got another myth being created here, and it's done deliberately. And when you're not being taught in school the correct history, when you're being taught in school that black people built Stonehenge, when BBC History tells you that blacks have played an important part here for centuries before they ever arrived, it's all part of this process of trying to create a new year zero, if I can say that. I've got to be very quick here because we have to go soon. And you're quite right, the only hope here in this country, you know, immigration is the #2 issue for potential Tory voters in this country. And yet the elites just simply don't get it because it suits big business to have cheap immigration coming in. You know, you had the Tory party membership voting for Liz Truss, even though she wanted to increase immigration to this country. I don't know what's going on there. The only way you're going to affect change under our first past the post system is to do for immigration what UKIP did for the referendum and what the Brexit party did to get Brexit done. That is, create a party not with any serious intention of coming to power, but to threaten a future Tory majority. And only then can you hold their feet to the fire and ensure that they do things. Now, the problem is, once they get elected, they simply forget about all the promises that they've made. But that's the best we can do, unfortunately. However, I don't think it's going to become a realistic scenario for at least 8 years or so, since it's highly unlikely that Tories will be facing a majority option in the future. But anyway, thank you very much.